So the EU had this announcement a couple months ago saying, if you want to serve a frontier model within the EU, we're going to mandate some requirements about watermarking the output of that AI. And like watermarking is most obvious in the image case. That's like you could literally put some indicator in the image to indicate that it's AI generated, or more likely you end up statistically modifying these pixels in order for it to look the same, but it has some mathematical signature on top of it that proves, hey, this was produced by Gemini or this was produced by Grok. It's called synth ID, is I think Google's term for it, but that's become adopted a little bit more industry wide. So the EU said this, you have to definitely do this for images, you have to definitely do this for videos, because we care a lot that people are not misled that these are in fact real.
This is all models have to do this.
All models have to do this that are in the EU. Huh. They extended that to also include text. So they said these frontier labs need to be able to figure out some way to leave some trace in text outputs as well that will allow us to reverse engineer what model it came from.
Yep.
So if you give me a paragraph, I'll be able to say as the EU Commission, hey, Richard, I'm actually saying that you wrote this whole thing with Claude instead of doing it yourself. So a lot of question marks around how companies would end up doing this.
Do you know how long they gave them to do this?
So yeah, so the timeline, the draft was published back in December of last year, December 17th. It's called The Code of Practice on Transparency of AI-Generated Content.
I like that your accent got a little bit more British there.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Beautiful.
I guess they're no longer part of the EU anymore,
that's
but
true.
it got vaguely European,
yeah.
which is probably as specific of an accent as I can do. It was finalized on June 10th of this year, which is actually a pretty fast turnaround time from June to now in August. Anthropic coming out and saying like, yes, we're going to support this as a first-class citizen. July, I guess there was some like signatory period that was also associated with this where companies had to sign on to this regulation, or at least got to choose to. Anthropic signed on in July.
They get to choose to do this.
I don't know if they get to choose to, but maybe it was just their way of saying, hey, we know we have to do this and we're just going to agree that we are going to do it. I think that's probably more what it was. So Anthropic signs, Microsoft, Google, Meta, OpenAI are also all on that list. The Article 5 transparency obligations took effect August 2nd of this year, right?
Yep.
So if you put a system on the market before that date, you're kind of grandfathered in to not have to do these watermark changes.
But any model released in the last like 2 weeks,
yes, has to
have to have
in
this.
Theory has to have this if it's shipped in the EU, which is also the nuance of like you could just not deploy it for the EU, and then technically get around this too. But Anthropic says, yes, we agree this is the right way to do it. We're going to add some watermarking Claude. We're going to get into exactly how they're doing that, the technical nitty-gritty, but they're going to do it worldwide, which is causing this outcry because even if we're not in the EU, we're not subject to this. It's a case of this Brussels effect where like this EU regulation is causing an industry changes happening worldwide. And Anthropic saying that all of their future models that are going to be released will be released with this watermarking technique.
Yep.
And that's true whether we live in the US, whether we live in New Zealand or Southeast Asia. And it's also obviously going to happen in the EU.
Yep.
So Anthropic's doing this. You might think like, okay, well, how do you do this watermark? Are you going to put some invisible, a little bit of ink? Unicode characters?
Yeah.
You smudge the like H letter a little bit. There's some criterion within the EU regulation that say that you have to be able to pass this through different copying stages, including OCR, right? So if I have some piece of text and I transcribe it one-to-one on like a typewriter, it still needs to pass along this watermark from the original text.
Interesting.
So you're like, well, how the hell am I going to do that? Like text is text. I don't even have the like.
It is crazy that they said like, this is what you guys have to do. Like innovate now.
Yeah, like figure it out.
Yeah, go for it.
I think it helps that there had been extending research and like precedent for doing watermarking on text. I don't know if they would have figured this out a priori, but that was the mandate. So then the result of that is that Anthropic is rolling out this statistical sampling approach for doing watermarking.
But they're copying what Google released.
They're basically copying what Google released. Do you want to talk a little bit about how they're doing it?
Yeah, sure. So this technique is actually not something that, as we were talking about, Anthropic created. It actually comes out of a paper that Google wrote in Nature a couple of years back, where they were talking about, how can we inject like this watermark into text? And so this technique that they came up with is called synth ID text. For the sake of this conversation, I think the most important thing to understand is that when you are using a model, when you're interacting with a model, there's actually two things that are happening in parallel that let you see the text. So you send a request to the model. The model parses your input, sends it through the model, and then what comes out is the model then predicts for each of the tokens that it's generating, for each of the words that it's generating, the most likely next sequence of words, right? So if you have the word like, what is 2 plus 2 equal? The model will see that input. And then at the very end, it'll have some likelihood over what the next most likely word is. And you can actually visualize this. You'll see that for all words that aren't 4 in this case, the probability is like 0.000001.
Yeah,
And then there'll be like a
tremendously small.
99.99999% probability on the word 4. And the model then sends that distribution over how likely the next word is to a sampler, right? And the sampler then will sample from that distribution what it thinks the next word is. So in this case, it's a very simple example. The sampler would say, oh, well, look, like basically there's 99.999% probability that the word is 4. So I'm just going to say that the next word should be 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that, you have a sentence like, hey, today the weather is very blank. Here, like the input to the sampler might be a probability distribution where words like sunny and rainy and cloudy are all like maybe 5% likely, right? And it's the sampler's job then to determine, okay, well, what word do I want to pick such that the user has the best possible user experience, right? And it might be the most likely word, like maybe cloudy has a probability of 5% and sunny has a probability of 4%. And so it'll say the word cloudy in that case. But maybe it sometimes switches it up a little bit, right? Maybe it experiments. Maybe every now and then it picks the third most likely word or the second most likely word, right?
Well, and it usually does, right? Because in the case where it's just taking the top score every time, that's like greedy.
That would be
decoding,
greedy,
basically,
exactly. Yeah,
which is taking the argmax, like the most likely value every single time.
Exactly.
The way that most models tend to work, or most samplers tend to work, when you hear terms like the temperature of this the sampler or the top P of the sampler, basically what it's doing is saying, I'm going to take all of that output distribution and put it on a number line.
Yep.
So like in that case, I'm going to do like 5% here. This is a better explainer actually if you're on YouTube, which I'll say, like and subscribe this episode if you are. Really helps us out. You have 5% here, you 5% here, you 5% there, and then the long tail of really small things. You're basically just like choosing a random point on this number line, and that's going to be your answer. So you assume if something has a ton of probability mass, almost every single time you choose that random point, it's going to be on that thing, right? Because it has the most proportion of the number line. If in this 5% case, you can kind of pick like any of the 5%, and it almost has an equal likelihood of like doing that over time, the more that you run these models.
Yeah, and if folks are curious, like nowadays, actually, you'll see like nucleus sampling as a very popular one. Top K sampling is kind of like what everyone uses. And you can combine that into even fancier sampling techniques like Bayesian, like posterior decoding. Like there's a bunch of research on, given some probability distribution, how do you pick the best possible next word, right?
That's
and
right.
that might not be the most likely next word. There's kind of a differentiator there. So anyway, these two things are totally separate. So you got your model and then you have your sampler, and these two things are sort of separate. Here, the idea with this Google paper, how you inject a watermark, is not actually by injecting it into the model at all. The model is the same. But you just play around with the sampler a little bit, this tiny little layer on top that you add to the model to inject the watermark to that sampling, so that once you then have the output of a model, you can then say, oh, the words that were sampled by this model seem like they were sampled from a Claude sampler or a OpenAI sampler, right? But I want to distinguish here. It's actually really important to point out, like, nothing is changing in the model itself. It's just the sampling of the words.
Yeah.
And so it gets a little mathy here, but what you can do is you can inject basically sort of this like random hash almost. A secret key into the sampler, so that on average, the sampler is still doing a good job of selecting the next likely word. But if you look at a very long piece of text over the course of many, many words that are sampled, you can say, hey, well, this kind of smells of the sampler that Anthropic would use, or this smells of the sampler that OpenAI would use, right? The text is still high quality text. It's still the same text that you would expect from these models, but something's just a little bit funky about how the sampler selected what the words should be, right? There's like a slight preference for something over something else. And so over the course of, many, many tokens, you can start kind of piecing apart with a certain probability. Okay, this is most likely Claude Sonnet 4, or this is most likely Opus 5, right? So that's kind of the big bird's eye view of this.
Yeah, great explanation. So Google's been doing this for a while, like I mentioned. Anthropic is pretty new to this game, but I think this broke through in a way that it never had with Gemini models. I suspect maybe because Gemini is much more of a consumer product. Claude's based for enterprise, and professional writers also very much prefer Claude. I think Google was maybe a little quieter about this approach in some ways, and it's been on Gemini for forever. It's been on them since 2024. So maybe just by the time people started learning about AI and using it, it was already there. It was baked in. This ignited an absolute shitstorm of people who are like, how dare you add this bias to this pipeline, be it the model or be it the sampler? And how dare you add that to API? How dare you add that to code? And how dare you add that to like other downstream harnesses that use Claude? Anthropic's like, well, that's just kind of part of the model now. That's just how we're doing things. I read a pretty good piece on this from John Gruber, who is this, Apple blogger, or at least has been in the past, is writing a lot more about AI these days.
Yep.
And really just deeply cares about the art of writing. Like this guy is a writer. He like sees it's been his career for forever, like doing this blog. And he published this piece on Sunday with an absolute teardown of Anthropic's argument here and their model, basically. And I encourage people to read it. I think it's well written. I don't fully agree, but I do want to give my sense of his representation of the arguments kind of against this watermarking approach are. A lot of it hinges, I think, for like him as a professional writer around this idea that even if words are close, they don't actually carry the same identical meaning. You know what I mean? Of like, he leaped at the chance is not the same as he jumped at the opportunity. They do, like, again, same kind of nut semantics, but like the syntactics of actually how you phrase it have some subtleties that like would matter in a longer piece, for instance. And when he's using these models, he's trying to use the models to act as a tool for him as a user, much like a hammer, or much like a carpentry set. And like what he thinks the best interests for him are choosing the best words given the best times, and doing that subject to cost and latency concerns. Like at the extrema, it might not be possible to get the perfect word every time, but the balance that model providers should be doing is on this axis of like, well, how much are they charging you for the service? And then how fast are you able to deliver the results? And then everything else, like given that frontier, should basically maximize for like, for CE loss in some sense of like, what is the best next thing to happen here, which is what we're trying to do. And like this sampling biases that in order to like give things that are like not as good, basically, is like his core argument. He said some other things in this post as well, from the fact that, Google's analysis of this kind of pointed to people's feedback on the text, giving thumbs up or thumbs down, and him being like, well, one, people are stupid. That was actually an argument that he made in the piece. And secondarily,
I like that. That's his like opening salvo.
That's the core, dude. That's the nut. I think we can all agree
that people are inherently
the average person
dumb.
is stupid.
Okay,
and that thumbs up, thumbs down evidence as like a feedback mechanism is inherently weak. That part I agree with. Incidentally, like it's a very bad way to get kind of qualitative feedback from people. You'd only ever downvote it if it's like super wrong.
Sure.
If it's like hallucinating or it's very much the wrong answer. If it's like a subtle word choice, you're probably not even going to take the time of day. I kind of want to like go into the technical core of his argument, being the fact that it's choosing the wrong word. Potentially, it's like choosing the most unlikely word over time, because that felt like the piece of things that was most incompatible with my understanding of that sampling process that you were just describing.
It is. Yeah. Let me actually answer this by giving you a story or a quick analogy.
Okay.
So basically, when we were in college, we would work on these. This is like back in like 2017, 2016, right? We'd work on these projects where we were using very, very simple neural networks at the time to generate text. And these models were really bad. And we hadn't quite figured, both the models were bad and the sampling techniques were really bad for generating text, right? And I remember I was working on this one project where we were trying to generate optimal Airbnb descriptions.
I remember this.
Remember this, right? We were trying to generate optimal Airbnb descriptions that could help, landlords optimally rent out their Airbnbs, right? So the idea is like, okay, given some bad description you might have written, can we generate a better description for you that is more likely to get interest from folks? And so as we trained this model, the model itself was actually learning pretty well. Like you would look at the loss function, the loss would go down. The model is good at predicting what the next likely token is. But we were using all these very simple sampling approaches. And what ends up happening when you sample from a model and just predict the most next likely token is the model will start predicting tokens that it thinks are good, but will then overfit to just predicting that token. So what ends up happening is in our model, you would end up with descriptions like, hey, beautiful, 2-bedroom loft in Brooklyn with great parking, and the parking is amazing with great parking over the river with great parking and tons of parking. So you can park anywhere where there's parking, and parking is important, and parking. And we would be like, well, why is this the case? And you would look at the distribution of words, and hey, turns out that if you offer someone free parking on Airbnb, that's a great description. People will like to click on that, right? And so the model is looking at, okay, well, what are the words that I have at my disposal? What's the most next likely word that might get people's attention?
Yeah.
Hey, parking, right? But what ends up happening if you're just solving this local equation, right? This like local preference, if you're trying to optimize people's attention, but just by looking at the most next likely word, you'll end up with something completely incoherent, right? So you do need to think about, okay, well, given everything I've said so far and given the distribution over words, what is now a good sampling approach? And that might not actually be the most next likely token. You might actually have to do something slightly smarter. So in the last 10 years, we've gotten better sampling approaches. Now people are doing much fancier things. And in part, that's why when we interact with these models, we actually get text that sounds very coherent and very fluid. We're not sampling the most next likely token, right? In some sense, when we look at how should we continue a sentence, the model is doing some deep math and introspection into, okay, well, what is the user experience that I want the user to have? And let me sample the token from that sort of meta distribution, right? Not the most next likely word, but the distribution over how can I make sure that users will keep using the platform? And that is already happening, right? So here, when he's saying like, okay, well, the model should generate the token that is the most likely, if that is his argument, it's just incoherent. Like it doesn't really make sense, right? Because that's not what we're doing currently.
Yeah.
And so adding this watermarking there, it's not changing the fact that already we're not doing the most next likely token. We're already doing something much more complicated than that, right? So I think this might be one of those scenarios where you really have to dig into the weeds to understand how the sampling works to then really realize that sampling is so complicated already. This watermarking makes it a little bit more complicated, but I don't think it fundamentally changes your user experience with these models.
Yeah. The thing is, you fundamentally don't want your model to be taking the next most likely thing. That's going to result in bad writing. It's actually the stochasticity of the generation process that ends up leading to fluid text.
The model's only job is to generate a distribution over words. That's all it does. The sampler then is the thing that takes that distribution and renders that into a good user experience for you. And these two things are separate.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's also one of the most famously hard tasks to benchmark is creative writing because it's so subjective. It's like the best way that we have right now, unlike coding, unlike a lot of these automation tasks, to determine whether or not the textual output of a model is good is by showing it to human beings.
Yeah.
And being like, do you prefer text A or text B? Just like on the merits of the piece, like consider everything holistically together. We have not yet been able to find some like automatic way or some like couple of principles that we can apply to text in order to say like, this is good, this is bad, which also means that if you're tweaking around with the sampler, even if you're not adding watermarking, we really don't have good feedback systems in place, unlike with regular model training, to be able to decide, yes, the sampler is better than this one. It's a lot of heuristics. It's a lot of like anecdotal evidence, a lot of like the decisions of the research teams that are going into this. So all of that said, basically where I net out on this is I think technically, I don't feel like in a gut feel like Anthropic is compromising the value proposition of Claude in order to be able to do this. I think that the output, even if you are doing creative writing, based on what I'm seeing just with the math and the math alone, it's only going to perturb the outputs than like maybe what would have been most likely with another sampling schema in like these like pretty limited niche, really like coin toss situations. In which case you were basically doing a coin toss anyway previously.
Yeah.
It's just changing like one of these internal
right.
gears to make it a little bit more like likely that you do one thing or another, and only doing that on like an aggregate of a bunch of texts.
Exactly.
So I think the technical things I feel a little bit better on in terms of like how they're implementing this. This isn't going to result in a worse model that we actually end up using. I'm sure some writers will like probably nitpick with that, but like just again, based on the math and like how things sample, I feel pretty strongly in that. I think the other things, the more like societal ramifications here, I almost think are more interesting, right? And the two that I want to pick your brain on are the first one, which is why Anthropic decided to roll this out worldwide instead of the EU. They give some very half-assed argument in their documentation around like, they just don't have the technical nuance to be able to do things by geography, to which I say, look at IP addresses,
Sure, yeah.
do KYC
Yeah.
compliance, like look at a credit card. That feels like kind of the easiest thing actually to do to be able to say if people are in the EU or not. But like, what do you think? Like, is that a choke of them releasing this worldwide? Or do you feel like they believe that watermarking is actually the way of the future? Therefore, they should, even if it wasn't regulated.
I think the big one here is China. Like we haven't even talked about them, right? I think right now Anthropic is very deeply worried that people are stealing their thinking traces. And, you don't have to be in China to steal Anthropic's thinking traces. You could do that in Africa. You could do that in Europe. You can do that in, South America. You could do that in Australia.
And in fact, a lot of people are. Did you see the article about these people in Africa that are being recruited?
I did. Yeah. Everyone is stealing thinking traces, right? So Anthropic is probably saying, hey, let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's just throw watermarks everywhere. And that's going to make us much more likely and make it much easier to catch folks stealing our thinking traces. Because now we can show like pretty decisively, like, no, this is a thinking trace that came from Anthropic. So if we see this floating around in the ether in the wild somewhere, we can identify that, right? That is honestly, I think, where the buck stops. Like that is the only argument that I think Anthropic really cares about.
Yeah.
And everything else is, I think, semantic sugar a little bit, how you want to frame this.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And they're doing that with the intuition that if you train on these thinking traces, it'll keep echoing this watermark for new things.
Maybe. Or if these thinking traces are leaked somewhere, then you can prove that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So why not?
That's a good point. I didn't think of that. The other thing was whether or not you're worried of people getting inadvertently flagged as AI for content that either they wrote originally and just had AI proofread, or they've embedded some quote in an article that was AI generated, but because there's enough of it, it like flags this filter that the whole thing was AI.
Interesting. So, and you're saying that is useful to Anthropic because
I'm saying that was one of Gruber's other concerns.
I see.
Was him basically saying if he's writing his blog, even if he's doing it fully by hand, if he's quoting someone who used AI that does have this watermark, it's kind of like a poison pill. It's like, that means that if you were to look at his whole site, I think depending on how the classifier is built a little bit, but if it's purely a binary classifier that says this piece of content is written by AI or this piece of content is not, instead of like a per word basis, if you send an email with an AI quote, or if you write a blog post with an AI quote, you can potentially get blocked or demoted on that piece or flagged as plagiarism by virtue of using an AI quote that wasn't even yours in the first place.
Maybe. I mean, that doesn't really concern me or like worry me too much. I mean, that sounds like just a classifier issue, right? Like you could at some point build a better classifier that goes paragraph by paragraph or sentence by sentence and just says, okay, is this sentence AI generated? Like that seems technically quite easy to do.
I don't know about sentence because you need at least 200 words to activate, but it's certainly per paragraph level. Yeah.
Or like a rolling window or something like that. Right.
Yeah. That's a good point too.
Yeah.
Cool. Any additional thoughts on this?
I mean, this is exciting, man. This was actually one of those questions that I thought would be really hard to solve. Like the technique for watermarking, maybe 5-10 years ago, I thought would be a very hard thing to do. Now that it's not only solved, or I mean, it seems to be almost solved, but that it feels so trivial is interesting. It's almost like how when SpaceX started landing the boosters, and everyone was like, "Whoa, we can do that!"
Totally.
This feels like that to me a little bit, where this felt like one of those things that would be really, really hard to do in our lifetimes. And now that it's here, it's kind of trivial. It's like, oh yeah, of course we can watermark these models. That's not a big deal.
Yeah, totally. I think it's impressive technically. I think I'm a little bit worried about how far ranging some of these classifiers are going to be applied to people's text. Like I think getting caught in this dragnet of being mistakenly classified.
Well, dude, I just assume everything is AI written at this point. Well, that solves it,
Keep your standards low, I guess. They'll always be met.
Well, as in, like, I just assume that everyone's using AI. Everything's written by AI, but then I hope that you're reviewing it and then that what you've written has been reviewed by you and has your stamp of approval,
I think that is overly ambitious for what people tend to do on the outputs of AI, but I agree in principle. Why I'm actually optimistic to some degree about watermarking is because I so often get an AI smell from content that people write and send to me, but I'm not sure. Like I'll maybe run it through GPT-0 or like some of these other detection services and it comes back with some AI score. Those are like super easy to fool or to get wrong. I think that there's like to some degree in the workplace, at least something nice about being able to say, hey, this piece of what I wrote was AI implicitly without people having like self-report that. And this piece was actually my original thinking. But I think just my TLDR is I really do hope we get back to people putting more effort into writing, both the thinking process as well as the eventual output. Clay had a really good letter on this last week. All policies that I agree with myself of like draft things yourselves, really write it. If you do use something AI, you should like really read every sentence and stand by it. You should never disregard what AI has written after the fact because you're wasting other people's time. So I feel like we're still kind of like learning our relationship with AI writing tools and how to bridge us doing things and them and then passing that to other people to consume too. So like, this is one thing, but I think that the hate that it's getting online is not warranted personally.
I agree.